I know I'm probably testing people's patience, but I want to do this. I owe it to a lot of things. 4 years of bloody war, 4 years of savage, unforgettable combat on the islands, in the air, and on the sea. And all was now suddenly overshadowed by the end of the war and the atomic bombs. Followed so quickly by the Japanese surrender, almost all Americans assumed that the amazing secret weapons alone were responsible. And almost all Americans, of course, were euphoric that the war was over. U.S. newspapers gladly felt the insatiable public demand to know more about these marvelous wonder weapons that could so suddenly force an enemy to end the war. The most terrible weapon in history, announced the New York Daily News. The bomb had more than 20,000 tons of TNT, more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It had more than 2,000 times the blast power of the British Grand Slam, which is the largest bomb ever yet used in the history of warfare. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. War Secretary Stimson revealed that even deadlier atomic bombs will soon be made. Improvements will be forthcoming shortly, which will be increased by several-fold the present effectiveness of the terror weapon. Referring to American leaders and the use of the new weapon, which could destroy entire cities and vaporize thousands of people in a split second, the Chicago Tribune commented that these wise U.S. leaders, by being merciless, they were merciful. To twist such Orwellian logic even further, the same paper displayed a sketch of the dove of peace flying over Japan, an atomic bomb in its beak. "Peace, our bomb clinched it," ran a headline from the Hanford, Washington newspaper, the town where the plutonium was manufactured for the first atomic weapon. "This town just totally went nuts," announced a resident of Hanford as workers' children paraded through the streets beating pots and pans. "It was a euphoria. Just the whole atmosphere was party time, patriotic." Indeed, many Americans, for at least one reason, were unhappy that the war was over. A poll conducted by Fortune magazine showed that a significant minority of U.S. citizens, 22.7%, wished that more atomic bombs could have been dropped on Japan. The words of American presidents surely did nothing to reduce that percentage. First learning of the incineration of Hiroshima while sailing home after his meeting with Allied leaders in Potsdam, Germany, Harry Truman was ecstatic upon hearing the news. "This is the greatest thing in history," exclaimed the president, his voice tense with excitement. "The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in this first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians. Japan began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war." Japan's power to make war was already completely destroyed, and Truman knew it. Bamboo spears and wooden bullets proved it. And those who also knew better, top U.S. military leaders, the Japanese government, especially Japanese survivors themselves, were not swayed in the least by such transparent lies and peacetime propaganda, either about the military nature of the targeted cities or that the end of the war and the Japanese surrender was due to the atomic bombs. On April 11, 1945, for example, U.S. military intelligence reported that Japan would quickly surrender if the Soviet Union entered the war against them. And as early as the Potsdam Conference that summer, Truman knew very well that Stalin would not only attack Japan as promised, but when he would attack, he'll be in the Jap War on August 15th, wrote Truman in his diary. "Finny Japs," when that comes about. The highest 8 ranking U.S. generals and admirals, 7 already had serious misgivings about the greatest thing in history, as Truman had termed it. One of those was Douglas MacArthur, overall military commander in the Southwest Pacific. It was not the atomic evisceration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the Pacific War. Instead, it was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the other Japanese colonies that began at midnight on August 8th. Between the two bombings, MacArthur condemned the bombing as an unnecessary slaughter. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who himself knew more than a little bit about the mass murder of a helpless enemy, yes, suddenly found a mote of pity when he registered his complaint against the use of the hideous new weapon. The Japanese were ready to surrender, the European commander wrote. It wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Even LeMay, a general whose firebombing attacks were responsible for vastly more civilian deaths than the new terror weapon, publicly admitted the atomic bombs were unnecessary and that Japan would have speedily surrendered without them. The bombs, he asserted, had nothing to do with the end of the war. Admiral William D. Leahy, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, heartily agreed. It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling was that being the first to use it We had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was taught not to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. The use of the atomic bombs with its indiscriminate killing of women and children revolts my soul, former U.S. President Herbert Hoover added shortly after the news reached her. With surrender and U.S. occupation, most of those who visited the destroyed cities after the surrender were horrified by what they saw and heard. Slowly at first, and despite U.S. censors, what had happened began to seep out at the world at large. Terrible as the atomic bombers were, with the passage of every day, it became clear and clear the worst was still to come. More and more as the euphoria over wars began to fade, many thoughtful Americans themselves began to harbor reservations, not only about atomic weapons and the terrible fact that they were used, but the reason for them being used when they were so clear were unnecessary. As Felix Morley, former editor of the Washington Post, so adequately summed up, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan was an infamous act of atrocious revenge. And as for those individuals from President Truman down who advocated the use of such terror weapons as the atomic bombs as a way to save lives by shortening the war, one of the foremost military historians in the world, Major General G.F.C. Fuller, begged to differ. Though to save life is laudable, it in no way justifies the employment of means which run counter to every precept of humanity and the customs of war. Should it do so, then on the pretext of shortening a war and of saving lives, every imaginable atrocity can be justified. As the above comments angrily made clear to many then, to many more now, it is difficult to bestow any moral equality, much less moral superiority, on any people who not only use a hellish weapon on women and children, but who use it on utterly defeated people who admitted they had lost the war and were trying desperately to surrender. And thus the war that began with a day of infamy at Pearl Harbor was now ending with another. This latter act of infamy, however, had far, far greater ramifications for the future of mankind and the world than the former. Meanwhile, with the close of actual war, those who had planned and waged that war to absolute unconditional victory could finally relax and rest on their laurels. The war with Japan is over as far as the creative work is concerned, announced U.S. Army Air Corps Commander Henry Arnold. The old general's curious use of words might suggest that the massacre of over 100,000 surrendering Japanese troops and the incineration of perhaps 1 million women and children was some beautifully creative artistic process. Nothing new about death, added an equally proud Curtis LeMay. Nothing new about death caused militarily. We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people in Tokyo on that night of March 9th and 10th than went up in the vapor of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And for at least one enthusiastic military historian, his look back on the accomplishments of the U.S. air power more resembled a radio broadcaster recapping an exciting sports contest than the wholesale massacre of innocents. Highlights of the entire 20th Air Force Blitz against Japan was the last 5 months of dynamic operation, and reaching this fiery perfection, which literally burnt Japan out of the war. The 20th came a long way from its meager beginnings. In its climactic 5 months of jellied fire attacks, the vaunted 20th killed outright 310,000 Japanese, injured 412,000 more, and rendered 9,200,000 homeless. Never in the history of war has such a colossal devastation been visited upon an enemy at so slight a cost to the conquerors. One might add that never in the history of war had so many women and children been murdered, both in Germany and Japan, and never in the history of war had so many of the murderers felt so little concern for the victims or so little moral compunction over the deed itself. Truly, World War II was the dark divide at which man willingly, even eagerly, began his slide back down that slippery slope of human evolution.